Hello and welcome to the Sociology 3 Module 7 video lecture on clarifying ambiguous terms. For the last few weeks we've been talking about identifying the basic components of an argument. You should be very familiar with those now, right? What are they? They're issues, conclusions, and reasons, right? And until we are able to identify those key parts of an author's argument, we won't be able to evaluate them. So this week what we'll be focusing on by discussing Brown and Keeley's Chapter 5 of Asking the Right Questions and also the Wellman reading, Connecting Communities On and Offline, we're going to talk about the importance of clarifying ambiguous terms, being able to identify ambiguity and to clarify when we come across ambiguous words or ambiguous phrases. And you're going to know very well after this lecture what I mean by ambiguous terms. So why terms matter for arguments, and especially for evaluating arguments? So once you've identified your issue, the conclusion, and reason in an author's argument, or reasons plural, you must next examine what these authors, what these communicators mean by the words that they use. Because you can't really evaluate their claims without understanding the meaning of important terms and phrases in their argument, right? Definitions matter. Words matter, what words they're using and certainly how they're using them. So a key critical thinking question that we really want to emphasize this week is learning to search for ambiguity, right? Where are there ambiguous terms and phrases, and how can we get more information about what these ambiguous terms and phrases mean? So first let's talk about the meaning of the word ambiguity itself. So ambiguity refers to when a meaning of something is uncertain in the context of the argument that we are examining. So as you all know, many words and phrases have multiple possible meanings and implications. So we have to be able to detect in an author's argument what particular meaning he or she is implying. So let's look at the example at the bottom of this slide. A very controversial issue, the issue of immigration, and this is one directly out of Chapter 5 of Asking the Right Questions. The government needs to drastically reduce immigration to the United States. The United States is already overpopulated, and we're suffering consequences such as high unemployment and serious water pollution. Also, immigrants endanger our American culture. Now, in reading this passage, can you think about what words or phrases you would identify here that are ambiguous, that have multiple possible meanings, that an author can mean in one of many different ways? So pause the recording and see if you can identify those. Okay, which ones did you identify? So first of all, let's look at that first sentence. The government needs to drastically reduce immigration to the United States. Drastically reduce. Reduce, I think we have a clear sense of what that means, right? To make less, to cut down. But drastically is very ambiguous. How much is drastic, right? One person's drastically could mean something very different than another person's drastically. Going along in the passage, serious water pollution. This author is claiming that immigrants cause serious water pollution. Well, what kind of water pollution are we talking about? Are we talking about contamination with chemicals? Are we talking about contamination with sewage? Are we talking about water maybe that could be used for certain purposes such as farming but not others? So water pollution, especially if you're talking from an expert perspective, can have very different meanings. And that last sentence, right, has some really important ambiguous words and phrases. This person says, also immigrants endanger our American culture. Well, what do they mean by endanger, right? Harm, risk, what are they talking about there? And then finally, American culture. What is American culture? America is a very, very diverse society. So to make the argument that there is some kind of mainstream American culture or one American culture singular, is very ambiguous. What exactly are we talking about? And what aspects of American culture are we talking about? Food, habits? Are we talking about language patterns? Are we talking about media viewing habits? A lot of different ways to define culture. So we would definitely want to inquire more in this passage and look for clues to see if the author defines more clearly what he or she means by these ambiguous terms and phrases. So there are several tips that Brown and Keeley offer us for identifying ambiguity. So there are several key places that we can look for in an author's argument to likely places to be able to detect ambiguous words and phrases. So the first one is just to look at key terms in the issue. Right? So first step there, we've got to identify the issue an author is talking about. So looking a little bit backwards towards last week's reading, remember we read the Simon reading, The Joys of Parenthood Reconsidered. I hope you enjoyed that. It's one of my favorites. And the issue she's talking about in that reading, right, is parents experience lower levels of well-being than their childless counterparts. Are there any ambiguous words in that? Oh, hopefully you've been able to detect them. Absolutely, right? What is well-being? Right? In some ways, we could even say that maybe parents might be ambiguous. Are we talking about certain kinds of parents? Are we talking about parents who have biological children, parents who had adopted children? Right? So when we're talking about social trends, we have to be very clear about which groups of people we're talking about. Well-being, we just said that was something that could definitely be ambiguous. And then childless counterparts, not quite as ambiguous, but we could even question, what exactly does it mean to be childless? Does that mean that one does not have their own biological or adoptive children? That's usually what it means, but you can see how even that would be right for some ambiguity. The next tip is we should identify key terms in the reasoning structure of the argument. So again, looking at the example of the Simon reading. So her conclusion, right, is that the social conditions in which American parents raise children really doesn't allow them to reap the full emotional rewards of raising children. And here again, we could see some more ambiguity. What does she mean by social conditions? That's a very abstract phrase. What are the full emotional rewards of raising children? She could mean various things, right? Happiness, contentment, meaning in life. Laughing, right? Kids do silly things and often make people laugh. Are we talking about that? Right? So that's what I'm getting at by saying that there are various meanings that an author could be referring to here. Number 3, you should also look for abstract words and phrases, and authors tend to use quite a few of these, right? And we tend to use quite a few of these in our everyday language. Equality, individualism, education, freedom, right? These are words that we come across a lot and that we ourselves probably use, but they could have very different meanings depending on the author. Another tip that you want to use is what Brown and Keeley call reverse role playing. Adopt the position of the author and then ask yourself, right, how would he or she likely define key terms and phrases? Depending on their particular disciplinary background, are they coming from a psychology perspective or a nursing perspective or a sociological perspective? And then try to just put yourself in the shoes of the author and say, okay, what does the author likely mean by this? So going back to the Simon reading, lower levels of well-being. Well, Simon's coming at it from a sociological perspective. She's a sociologist, and she does indeed, and she specifies later in the reading that she means measures of well-being that include anxiety and depression. So typically ways that social scientists, especially psychologists, tend to define well-being. So we also want to learn to rely on context to provide clues to help us figure out what authors mean by ambiguous terms or phrases. Again, think of a writer or speaker's background, not only their disciplinary background, but if they tend to, take a particular stance on an issue. So maybe they're working for an organization that, is trying to restrict immigration to the United States. So maybe if they're affiliated with that organization, that might help you figure out what they're talking about. You can also think in terms of traditional uses of a term in relation to a particular controversy. So when people typically write about a particular subject, are they typically using that word in a particular way? And then finally, we always want to rely on context. If you remember, I know my elementary school teachers definitely talked about this concept of context clues. Your teachers in elementary and middle school probably talked about that too, right? As you're learning to read, and they would tell you, hey, you're going to come across a lot of words and phrases that you don't understand. And oftentimes, when you look at the words before or after the word you don't know, that can help you figure out what the word means. And that's exactly what Brown and Keeley are talking about, what you've probably learned as context clues. So there are some typical ways of defining key terms. Synonyms, examples, and definition by specific criteria. So these help you figure out ways that authors will typically try to define potentially ambiguous terms, but also how you yourself could go about defining terms that your readers might find ambiguous in your own writing. So a synonym, right, so a word that means the same thing, is a very common way of defining key terms. So I use the example of happiness here, different ways we might define happiness. Happiness is feeling joy. So joy is a synonym for happiness. But you can also define key terms by offering your reader an example. Happiness is what you feel when you make a good grade on an exam. I always felt happy when I made a good grade, and that's an example of a case in which you might feel happy. Finally, you can also define key terms by using specific criteria. So for example, a common way of defining happiness is as a subjective feeling of well-being combined with the sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. Now, which of these three is the more specific definition of the term happiness? If you guess the last one, specific criteria, you would indeed be correct. So hopefully, if an author is writing well and doing a good job of trying to clarify any ambiguous terms, he or she is not only using synonyms and examples, but also giving you specific criteria for what those key terms mean. And in your own writing, you'll definitely want to provide specific criteria as well. So now I want to talk about the Wellman reading, Connecting Communities On and Offline. I absolutely love this reading. It's a little bit dated. It was originally published in 2004, so it's over a decade old, which is pretty old, especially considering that it's on technology. But it's actually still a really useful way for thinking about how technology is shaping social interaction in our society today. So again, we want to always go back to the basics. What is the issue? What is the conclusion? And what reasons does Wellman offer for why you should support his conclusion about the issue? So first of all, the issue, right? He's really inviting us to consider how the internet affects social interaction. How is it shaping social interaction? Is it allowing us to connect even more with people that we want to interact with, or is it somehow impeding or diminishing social connection? This has been a key debate in the literature on technology, right? Does it pull us apart, or does it bring us together? Okay, so that's his issue. Now, let me ask you this. In the issue right there, just if we're looking at the issue as how the internet affects social interaction, are there any ambiguous terms or phrases? And if you guessed social interaction, you would indeed be correct. What is Wellman talking about when it comes to social interaction, right? Is he talking about texting? Is he talking about sending an email? Or is he talking about talking with one another in a face-to-face kind of communication? So social interaction can mean very different things, and Wellman actually talks about those different kinds of social interaction throughout this reading. His conclusion that I pulled right from the top of page 22, I love those little summaries they offer in the context reading. They offer give you some really explicit information about what the author's conclusions are. And here he says, rather than isolating users in a virtual world, the internet extends communities in the real world. People use it to connect in individualized and flexible social networks rather than in fixed and grounded groups. So he is saying quite a lot in that conclusion, right? Are there any ambiguous terms or phrases here? Absolutely, right? So we already talked about social interaction and the issue. Looking at the conclusion, right? Virtual world, what does that mean? It extends communities. What does he mean by community? And what is the real world? What about the phrase individualized and flexible social networks and fixed and grounded groups? Right, so what can we do to try to help us clarify these ambiguous terms? Well, we can certainly look at the writer or speaker's background. Wellman is a sociologist. So we might think about, right, how sociologists typically use the term community. Sociologists use that word in a variety of ways. It certainly means people that live in the same household, live in the same neighborhood, but sociologists also use that word to refer to people who go to the same educational institution, such as we might say the Fresno State community. In terms of the second key tip, traditional uses of the term in relation to a particular controversy. Well, virtual world versus real world, right? Those can be very ambiguous, but chances are that you all, given that we have been part of the internet revolution for well over the last decade, many of you have probably been online for all of your adult lives, and of course, depending on your age. I know I'm making a big assumption there. I have not. I did not send my first email until well into my 20s, which says a little bit about my age. But you know, we're familiar with these words, virtual world versus real world. How do people typically use those phrases when they're talking about the internet? Well, virtual world typically refers to what's happening online, right? Whereas real world tends to refer to what's happening usually in face-to-face interaction. And then last, we can rely on this tip of context clues, or the words before and after the ambiguous terms. Right, so if there's anything in here in the context, and I know I'm not providing you too much context just in this particular quote here, but if you, and hopefully you have, hopefully when you read the Wellman reading, or when you've already read the Wellman reading, right, he goes in that article and he talks about what exactly he means. So going back up to the issue, how the internet affects social interaction. He's very clear to say throughout the reading, right, what he means by social interaction, right? He says there are actually various ways to think about it. You can think about social interaction as texting someone. You can think about social interaction as sending them an email. Now he was writing in a time when this wasn't really available, but Skype or Face Chat. Or all these other technologies that you guys are probably well aware of that I know nothing about. But that's social interaction too, right? It's not just face-to-face interaction. And at various points in the reading, he does actually specify very clearly when he means face-to-face interaction versus when he means virtual interaction. And that's something that a really good author does. And what Wellman's trying to do is give you more information to help clarify these potentially ambiguous terms. So hopefully this lecture and reading chapter 5 of Brown and Keeley have been really helpful for allowing you to think about how it is that we tune our minds to detecting ambiguity, and tips that we can use to try to clarify those ambiguous terms.